Hello, one and all, and welcome to an episode of Top Deck Thoughts. Now, for this episode, I decided to actually cover technically Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday spoilers for Zendkikar Rising. Now, for the reason why I was off a few days was mostly because I had to take care of my brother's little dog Archer, cutest little guy. Plus, also I was playing some casual EDH games over the weekend with Trap as well as with Zuby. So I kind of took a little bit of time off on that, but I do want to talk about some of these new cards and such because some of them are actually really saucy. Now, for clarification, to make sure to keep the length of this video short, I will cover the cards that I think will be good for constructed. If I skip over any specific card that you want to see a 2 cents on, you can ask me through either Twitter or through the YouTube comments down below. Just keep in mind, if I skip it, there's a really good chance that I think it's mostly good for just limited and doesn't have much constructed application. So keep that in mind. Nevertheless, let's actually get started with Stonework Pack Beast, a 2 mana 2/1 artifact creature beast. It is also a cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard. And it has the ability that you see like on prism like creatures where you can spend 2 mana to add 1 mana of any color. Now, one thing I will say, this is a card that I think is actually going to be really, really decent and limited if you are brewing around the party base deck. But I do actually think this actually has some constructed applications, weirdly enough. I feel like for budget decks that are trying to do the party base mechanics, like I said before, I think a budget party deck is going to exist. And I do think this is a card that's within your 2-drop slot that if you can't get one of the more powerful rogues, clerics, warriors that you would put in that deck design because you're on a budget, I feel like this is a decent choice at the very least. It's a 2-drop. You can use any mana of any color to cast it, and you could use it to fulfill your role of whatever you need for your party. So, also, just quick distinction again for people who are now starting to watch this. No, this card is not going to fulfill your whole party. You do have to have each 4 individual creatures of the different creature types of the party-based mechanic to fulfill it. So if you have, say, 4 Stonework Pack Beasts, then your party is fulfilled if you go for that quest. But one of them is not going to fulfill the whole party thing, but it will count as one toward it, so keep that in mind. Nevertheless, I think it's actually a decent card for budget decks that are doing the party-based mechanics, so keep an eye out on it. Next up, another card that I think is actually going to be really good also that's upcoming, that's more like better and limited, but also I do think has constructed application in the cat dog decks, is actually Mesa Links. It's a 2-drop 2/1, which is not that exciting, but it's a cat, which is mattering in like the Rin and Siri cat dog decks, as well as it has a pretty nifty ability that as long as it's not your turn, Mesa Links gets +2 toughness. So this kind of reminds you of, say, for I'm going to take Hearthstone as an example. This reminds me as a 2-drop semi-Tar Creeper. Now, granted, Tar Creeper had Taunt, which actually made it a teeny little bit better, but I do think Metzalinks actually, with that plus toughness on the opponent's turn, actually is pretty good against the aggro-based matchup, since it makes stuff like being able to block against Fervent Champions or any 1-drop that is even a 1-mana 2/2 even. So I do feel like Metzalinks is just a really decent budget option for the cat dog decks. Don't underestimate the toughness boost you get during your, if it's not your turn. That's actually pretty nifty. Now, are there probably better 2-drop cats? Maybe, but I do think it's something to keep in mind, especially if you are doing cat dog shenanigans. Now, here's a weird card. And this is probably one of the weirder mythics they spoiled as of Sunday. It is Scourge of the Skyclaves. 1 in a black for a Star that doesn't have flying. Keep that in mind. It's not a flying demon. Or that flying demon, you know what I mean. But it does have a kicker of 4 in a black. It has, when you cast a spell, if it was kicked, each player loses half their life rounded up. And then, Scourge of the Skyclave's power and toughness are each equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. I'm going to be honest, I'm kind of grateful I kind of delayed doing this review of these cards, because when I initially saw this card, I kind of thought it was really, really bad. A lot of people were making a comparison that this was like, oh, this is like the Death Shadow for Standard, and I'm going to be honest, not even close. The reason why I say that is because, technically speaking, the reason why Death Shadow is a very powerful archetype is because to get the big power and toughness on Death Shadow, you only have to manage 1 life total, which is your own. Which, yeah, you constantly shock yourself, you ping damage to yourself to make Death Shadow really big, and then swing in for lethal when you do little incremental damages yourself with stuff like Lightning Bolt, etc., etc., etc. Scourge of the Skyclaves has the problem where you have to manage, I guess technically speaking, you have to manage two life totals. You have to manage your own life total, and you have to manage the life total of the opponent. Now, one could make an argument that you could still do a deck design like in the Rakdos variety, where you can constantly like ping yourself, like with that 2-cost enchantment that constantly pings someone on the beginning of their upkeep, as well as just like spells that you can pay life and then just go on an aggro plan and then get this into be a decent creature, maybe even as a finisher with a combo like with Terror of the Peaks. And while that deck is definitely in the back of my brain, I do feel like that is not going to be the best approach with this card. And I was originally going to throw it off as a really bad card. However, there is actually one really nifty combo that someone did point it out to me that kind of made me change my opinion of the card with a total 180. And that is with specifically Nephroi Apex of Death. Now, what's the combo? Many people are probably not seeing the combo, but here's the thing. You can actually put this in a life gain deck, and actually it synergizes pretty well. And here's how it synergizes. Essentially what happens is, Scourge of the Skyclave's power is going to be monitored throughout all its stances, including when it's in the graveyard. So if you can find a way to throw Scourge of the Skyclaves in the graveyard and keep your life total, or even your opponent's life total, at a decent amount, let's just say, for example, let's say your life total, you're able to manage it in a life gain deck and make it like at least 30. So Scourge of the Skyclaves is going to be a -10. However, with the way how Nephroi is worded when you mutate on something, so maybe you mutate on one of your life link dorks or something like that, when you do the mutation, you return any number of target creature cards with total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Since Scourge has a negative power when it's in the graveyard, you can actually use that to actually get additional power onto the battlefield than the initial 10. So let's say it's -10. With -10, you could get 10 additional power creatures on the battlefield. And that's even including if you only have one Scourge in the graveyard. If you have multiple, then this just adds up more, and you can do some ridiculous reanimated shenanigans. Now, obviously, in EDH, people are just going to throw this in Nephroi and just have some fun with the shenanigans you can do with it. But I think in Standard, if an Absan or maybe even a Sultai life gain deck can work, then I think this card will actually see a lot of play. So I say keep an eye on those like life gain decks, because especially if they're going to employ the Nephroi mutate ability, because that's where it's going to see a majority of its shenanigans. So keep an eye on this card. It's a lot better than it looks at first glance. I will say that right off the bat. Next up, it's Concerted, I think it's how you pronounce that word, defense. 1 blue for an instant counter target non-creature spell unless its control plays 1, plus an additional 1 for each creature in your party. I think this card is actually secretly one of the really good card for party-based deck designs, because one of the main issues that parties are going to have in general is that you want to keep your party together. Like, you want to add up, get all the creatures on the battlefield. The problem is, though, spot removal is a thing, and also board wipes is a thing, and the majority of the popular spot removal / board wipes are non-creature spells. So, I do feel like if a party deck that has blue within its deck design, which honestly I think the Azorius Flyer party deck can actually be a theme, hint hint, wink wink, nod nod, I do think they are actually going to play this card without a sweat, because a majority of the time it is going to just be a 1-mana Spell Pierce. And Spell Pierce in tempo-based deck designs is actually really, really good. And I do feel like the Azorius Flyer party deck is going to be a tempo-based deck design. So, yeah, this card is actually legit really good. Don't sleep on it, especially if you're doing party-based mechanics. This card can actually be a really good tech card, either in the main, but I can even see it in the sideboard, especially if you want to help counter against like the board wipes and also like spot removal of the worlds. So, keep an eye on it. Next up is Turn Timbo Symbiosis, which is a 7-mana sorcery spell that's also the model Mythic Cycle lands, where, keep in mind, this will flip into a land that you can enter and untap as long as you pay free life. But essentially, it has the spell portion is look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may put a creature card from among them into the battlefield. If that card has converted mana cost 3 or less, it enters the battlefield with 3 additional +1/+1 counters on it. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. Now, I'm going to say, out of the whole Mythic Modal land cycles, that is a spell and also a, I guess, bulk land is what we're calling them now, this is probably one of the best ones of the bunch, in my personal opinion, maybe tied with the red one. And the reason why is because this is actually a really powerful ability in Mono Green Stompy or good mid-range rule decks. Just being able to put this in your land slot, because I do feel like this is a safe 2 of in your land slots in the kind of like Stompy decks. Being able to have this as a late game spell, just being able to essentially dig into your card, get a Stompy creature, and put it onto the battlefield like that, and even if you whiff and get like a lower converted mana cost creature, then it gets the +3 additional counters on it. That is very nice. Now, one thing I'm going to say, and I actually am going to take the advice that I learned from Jeskai Guy, I believe, Angelo, I believe is his name on Twitter. And he essentially, when he said his advice with these type of lands is actually more applied to EDH, but I do think it's also going to be applied to more constructed formats, so keep in mind. If you plan to use this card as a land, be prepared to play this as a land a majority of the time. But however, if you're planning to use the card as a spell, be prepared to use the card as a spell a majority of the time. And I do feel like when you're doing your deck designs with this, I'm definitely going to have a separate video where I'm going to talk about how you should design with the modal split cards in mind when regarding to brewing and such. But I do feel like that is a really good advice. So if your deck design is very dependent on turn Timber Symbiosis, not just like an extra plus, then it's probably better to keep it within your spell slot with your deck design and not be like, oh, I'm just going to throw it into my lands, because there's a chance you might need to use it as a land a majority of the time. However, if you're not really needing to use this, but it just would be a nifty spell to, let's just say, be a plan B, so to speak, and you don't mind playing as a land a majority of the time, then you can throw it in your land slot without a sweat, and then just have the extra ability that if you draw it late game, it becomes this really powerful spell. So keep that in mind with these spells. Probably the green one, along with the red one, is probably my favorite of the bunch of these. So yeah, really good. It's probably going to see play in multiple formats, most likely. This is one of the better Mind Rots that we actually have got in standard for a while, and it's Mind Drain, ironically enough. 2 and a black for a sorcery spell. Target opponent discards 2 cards, mills a card, and loses 1 life. You gain 1 life. Now, one thing to keep in mind, there is one difference to this to Mind Lot, is that you can't target yourself with the discard. I know that doesn't really matter a majority of the cases, but there are some times where you're doing a reanimator based strategy. You do like the fact that you can discard your own cards, so yeah, keep that in mind. But a majority of the time, I could actually see this card having a potential in budget control decks, the blue-black variety. Being able to have that Mind Rot ability is very nice, and also just the fact that it draws a, well, you gain 1 life, just very nice, and milling a card. I almost thought this said draw card. I was having a brain fart there with another cycle that we're going to talk about pretty soon. But yeah, the fact that even at its worst, it's still a free mana, mill, and lose a life. It's very anticlimactic, and I don't think you want to go full playset with this card. But in some control decks, especially the blue-black variety, I think as a 2 of is actually surprisingly decent. So it could also be easily cut if we get more better control spells. I could definitely see that. But if you do need like a Mind Rottish ability because you're doing like maybe a Crota based deck design or something like that, definitely keep this card in your brain. But also keep in mind that milling could also be costly, especially if you're going against an Ura deck. So keep that in mind. Be prepared to sideboard this out pretty quick if you need to. That's probably one of the better uncommon equipments that came from the set. Like, this is, in my opinion, way better than the Rakdos equipment we got. Skyclave Pickaxe. 1 green, just 1 green for a equipment. And when it enters the battlefield, it does the whole thing that Zendkikar-based equipment mechanics are doing, where you can just attach it to a target creature you control, like that. But the special ability of this equipment is that it has landfall, and it's whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, a crypt creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And I'm just going to say this, don't sleep on this card. This card is actually surprisingly really efficient in rule-based aggro decks. As well as I think in modern and maybe even historic, it has the potential in prowess-based aggro decks. Because here's the thing. Let's even go off the random. Let's say you're playing like Team or Prowess for some reason. and you play like, let's say, Sprite Dragon, then you could like turn free, just play this before playing your land, put on the Skyclave Vats, and then it still gets the plus counter boost on the Fairy Dragon. Then you can play your land for turn, which then gets the plus two boost. And then let's say that land is like a Fabled Passage, and then you get another plus two boost. The fact that we have both Fabled Passage as well as Evolving Wilds, yes, I know many people don't like playing Evolving Wilds, but I do think with Landfall being a mechanic in Standard again, you might want to keep an eye on Evolving Wilds. So, yeah, especially if you're doing more Landfall based designs, so keep that in mind. But the fact that you can get your Fairy Dragon to be. Let's see, let's do the math here. Let's presume you play Fairy Dragon on turn 2. Turn 3, you play the Skyclave Pitsat. It gets a +1/+1 counter, so it's a 2/2. Then when you do that, then you play the land, which then gives it a +2/+2 boost, which is 4. So then you can literally attack on turn 3 with a 4/4, and if that land was a Fabled Passage or Evolving Wilds and you crack it, then you can attack on turn 3 with a 6/6 flyer. That is ridiculously absurd, and that's not even talking about the historic applications and prowess, like with stuff like the one drop that has prowess that I always forget the name of that does the -1/-1 counters when you do burn damage. Someone will remind me in the comments. But there's stuff like that. So, and I think even in Gruul, just being able to like say the more silly applications like turn 1 play your goose and then turn 2 to quit the goose with the sky pickaxe and just swing in with a flying 2/2, which is actually not bad. It's actually not bad at all. So yeah, I think Skyclave Pickaxe is going to be subtly one of the more better aggro cards that is coming thanks to this set. So keep an eye on it. That's all I'm going to say. Just keep a good eye on it. Next up, Glacial Grasp. 2 in the blue for an instant spell. Tap target creature. Its control mills 2 cards. That creature doesn't untap during its control in its untap step, and you draw a card. I like this card a lot. I feel like it is a tempo. This card is actually surprisingly really decent. Especially if you do stuff like a turn 2 aggro creature and then turn 3, you could just cast this on your main step. So you can swing in 4 points of damage, and the opponent can untap the creature during their upkeep, which then allows you to swing in for more damage. That's very nice. Granted, if this was free mana, not draw a card, I would be a lot more iffy about it. But the fact that it says draw a card does make this card a lot more effective than these type of cards do in the past. So the fact that it taps as well as mill the up 2 cards from your opponent, that is very nice, especially if you're playing this in like a rogue deck of sorts. But still, you gotta be cautious with mill because, like we said before, Uro is still a card, so you gotta keep that in mind as well as Kroxa. Still, I like this card a lot. I do feel like in tempo-based decks, this is a card to keep a good eye on because it's actually a really decent turn-free tempo play, especially if you have an aggressive 2-drop. Next one, a dragon that got spoiled by Brian Kibler, because, of course. Leyline Tyrant, 2 and 2 red for a flying 4/4 dragon. And even then, if it didn't have the extra bit of that Tets, just a 4 mana 4/4 flying dragon, that could be good in the right aggro deck. So, with even that little bit additional piece of Tets, it's still a pretty decent card. However, that additional piece of Tets kind of makes the card a teeny little bit nutty. So let's read it. You don't lose unspent red mana as steps in phases end. So if you had like 1 red mana floating at the end of your turn, you still hold on that red mana during your opponent's turn and during your turn as long as Leyline Tyrant stays on the battlefield. Plus, it also has an ability that when Leyline Tyrant dies, keyword dies, so if it gets exiled, this effect is not going to happen, but if it dies, you may pay any amount of red mana. When you do, it deals that much damage to any target. So it can target the opponent. This card is nutty and a half. This card is really good. Like I said, a 4 mana 4/4 flyer, that is just good stats in general. People in the mid-range aggro decks are going to play a 4 mana 4/4 flyer, no matter what. And the fact that now it has this kind of combo-ish shenanigans insurance where you can store red mana with it to use as an insurance that if it dies, you can lightning bolt to even do lethal damage to your opponent, that is ridiculously absurd, especially if you throw it into a combo deck of sorts where like maybe you have stuff like Ironcrag Feet or even just like a lot of mana dorks where you pump all the red mana into it and then you can store it and then wait and wait until you find a way for it to die and then just deal lethal damage to your opponent. Like maybe if you have like fiery emancipation on the battlefield or stuff. There's some silly shenanigans. Also, one thing to keep in mind with this card that I think people are kinda underrating that I think is a good thing about the card if you're playing this in an aggro or mid-range deck. I feel like this card is a good decoy card. I do think this is a card where, let's say you're playing Gruul, and you play this card. I do feel like many opponents, if they have the spot removal, they are going to remove it as soon as they can. And if they remove it on the turn, then you don't mind because you play a land and then play your Elder Gargoth. You're using Leyline Tyrant as a lure for your more powerful late game creatures, such as Elder Gargaroth, maybe if you're playing like Boros, Baneslayer Angel, etc., etc. So I do feel like with the power level of Leyline Tyrant, I do feel like you do want to have a backup plan to use the excess red mana and all that for the potential for ramp. Which, by the way, if you use this for potential ramp, you could use this to ramp out a really quick Ugin, so keep that in mind. Ugin's going to see so much play in standard post rotation. It's not even funny. But with that being said, I do think this is also a powerful decoy card, which you can use to help fish out a spot removal. So then you can play some better 5-drop that your opponent might accidentally waste their spot removal for to get rid of this threat, because this threat can be really scary if not unanswered. So keep that in mind. This is a very powerful red mythic. And not the only powerful red mythic in the set, but we'll get to it when we get to it. Next up, a very surprisingly powerful 2-drop, Magmatic Channeler, 1 in a red for Human Wizard 1/3, as long as there are 4 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard. Magmatic Channeler gets +3 attack and +1 toughness. So if you meet this condition, it can literally be a 2-mana 4/4. And also, it has an activated ability of discard a card, X out of the top 2 cards of your library, then choose one of them. You may play that card this turn. This is very good. This is one of the... Like, we're going to talk about another powerful 2 red drop, but this is another really good powerful red drop. The reason why it's so powerful is because the factor is, one of the more powerful deck archetypes that they're trying to brew, or at least encourage people, is the blue-red Wizards deck. And mostly the blue-red Wizards deck are going to have a lot of instant and sorcery spell interactions, whether of the kicker variety or of just the burn or tempo spell variety. So the factor is, you can, if you throw a lot of ops, throw a lot of shocks, etc., you can get this to be a 2-mana 4/4 pretty quick later down in the game and such. And the factor is, once you empty your hand out, because you are playing a tempo deck of sorts, or you're playing kind of like an aggro mid-range deck with this, the factor then that if you don't need to use it for the aggro, that you can just use it for impulse draw, very, very nice. Especially it's helped the top deck, maybe the final shock you need to deal lethal damage to the opponent or such. So this is going to see play. It's probably have a chance to see play in standard as well as potentially Pioneer and maybe even Modern. Keep an eye. This card is really good. Next up, a surprising 2-drop that we actually got for the set, Luminarch Aspirant, 1 in a white for a Human Cleric 1/1. At the beginning of combat of your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. I do feel like if you're playing the Selesnya decks, this is definitely something to keep in mind. However, I do think the 2-drops in Selesnya counters is a little bit competitive at the moment, so I do feel like this is more of a 1 or 2 of in that deck. You might go full playset just to test it out. The ability to put a +1/+1 counter on each combat during your turn is a very powerful effect. Like, it can make your Stonecoil Serpents bigger, it can make... Like, a lot of counter-based synergies are in the Selesnya counters deck, so the fact that it can synergize, like with that Hydra, that whenever a counter is put on another creature, it gets bigger and such. So, I definitely can see this as an engine for Selesnya counters. Maybe it goes into some party decks, but I highly doubt it, unless if Selesnya counters can go into a party-based design. Still, I do think it's a very interesting 2-drop, because at the worst, it can just be a 2-mana that, if it's the only creature on the battlefield, it can buff itself up to a 2/2, which, granted, that's not great. But I do feel like if you throw this into a Selesnya counter deck-based design, it actually gets a lot better really, really quick. So, keep an eye. I do think this has some pretty good applications in those type of deck designs, personally. Next up, scale the heights. 2 and a green for a sorcery spell. Put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. You gain 2 life. You may play an additional land this turn, and you draw a card. Now, I wanted to talk about this card specifically because I do think it's actually pretty powerful if you are playing with a lot of the Moto lands. I think a mistake that's going to be made, and a lot of people, when they look at this card, they're going to be like, wait, Uro's still a card. Uro's a lot better than this. And yes, but I do think there's one con with Uro with regarding the Zendkikar Rising coming, other than the potential that it might get banned, but that's another story entirely. There is one con to Uro regarding to the Moto split lands that people don't realize. Due to the way that Moto split lands work, they're always going to be a sorcery on front. It's never the land on front. So what happens is with that, when you play Uro, since Uro has specifically says you may put a land on the battlefield, not play, you can't actually play the land part of the Moto spells as a land with the Uro trigger, since it's not a play trigger, it's a put trigger. And a put trigger tracks to see if your hand has an additional land you could put on the battlefield when that trigger happens. And since technically when it's in your hand, it's considered a either instant or sorcery or creature or whatever, you can't use Uro to do that. Why did I say that specifically? It's because I want to let people keep in mind, as well as in past standards, any card that says you may play an additional land. Because those cards do synergize with the Moto spells, since you can play the spell portion as a land since you are playing it rather than putting it. So I wanted to use this card to actually talk about that. Nevertheless, the card itself is actually a really good card. Just a free mana, make your 2-drop bigger, very nice. As well as being able to gain 2 life, also nice. And then playing additional land this turn and drawing a card, that's very nice. I can actually see some people throwing this in their deck if they're playing like stuff like Lotus Cobra, since you can use this on turn 2 Lotus Cobra. Turn 3 this, hopefully play 2 lands to get 2 mana discount on Scale of Heights, which is actually ridiculously absurd when you think about it. So, yeah, and then putting a counter on the Lotus Cobra to make it bigger, that's nice as well. So, yeah, I actually like this card a lot. I think this will actually see constructed play. Granted, people are going to compete in. I don't know about it in blue green decks, since, of course, yes, Burrow's a thing. However, if your deck is running modal design cards, like of the spell split variety, and you do need to use them as lands, as I stated before, be very cautious when playing with Uro. I would say play Scale the Heights kind of in a split with Uro, if I'm being honest. So, yeah, keep that in mind. But let's be frank, Uro is probably not going to survive till, I'll give it till January? Maybe till Kaldheim comes out, probably. Next up on the list is Yasharin Implacable Earth, a 2 green and a white creature, elemental boar. It's a 4/4, and it has when it enters the battlefield, you search for a basic forest and a basic plains, put it into your hand when you reveal them. And it also has a taxing effect that players can't pay a life or sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activate abilities. This is actually a pretty interesting card, I'm going to say that. This is more or less a 4 mana draw too. Yes, they are just basic lands, but that is actually pretty powerful, especially if you are trying to ramp to a turn 5 or turn 6 play. So you really got to keep that in mind. Also, one nifty thing about this card is its taxing effect on specifically sacrifice decks, especially those that play Woe Strider. The fact that they can't activate their Woe Strider or their Witch's Oven is actually pretty significant, so this is a really nice tech card against those decks. One of the more janky approaches to this card, though, that I did heard about that's actually really cute, is if you play this in a Naya deck, and you have this out along with Terror of the Peaks, due to the way that Terror of the Peaks is worded, Yasharin actually protects Terror of the Peaks, since they can't pay the life to actually cast the targeted removal spell that actually can be targeted on Terror of the Peaks. That's actually a really cute combo that actually makes me tempted to do kind of like a Naya shenanigans deck of that sort. Nevertheless, keep an eye on this card. It is not the most exciting card of the bunch, but it is very practical. A 4 mana 4/4 that draws 2 cards. Also elemental, so if you have elemental triggers, keep that in mind. As well as this could also be a good card to have for landfall based decks. So, yeah, keep an eye on this. Also, by the way, due to the fact of how ramp is in the standard, you could probably get this on turn free most of the time, which is actually ridiculously absurd when you think about it, especially since you can consider this kind of like a cultivate that gives you a 4/4 on turn 3. So, yeah, really good card. It will probably see play if Selesnya would want to play this card. And they are probably one to, especially since sacrifice decks are still going to be a little bit present in the meta, in my personal opinion. Next up is Inscription of Abundance. 1 in a green for an instant that has kicker of 2 in the green. Choose one. If this spell was kick, choose any number instead. You have the choice of putting 2 counters on a target creature, or a target player gains X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, or target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. Now, I will say this, with all the inscription cycle, this is definitely the most powerful of the bunch. Just a 2 mana instant just to get any of those effects is actually a really nice modular spell. Being able to fight a target creature, very nice. Being able to put 2 counters to use as a combat trick in post combat or even mid combat, very nice. Also, just if you need to, being able to gain life if you need to, if you're going against an aggro matchup, very nice. And if you can kick it later down the line, just getting all those abilities is actually really, really nice. So, Inscription of Abundance, I think, will see play in Standard. It's definitely going to be interesting to see if it sees play in multiple formats. It does have a chance in EDH, I will say. Nevertheless, though, very powerful card and probably, at least so far, one of the most powerful inscriptions that they revealed. Next up, Crag Plate Bailoff. In other words, one of my friends who's mono green Stompy is going to love this card. 5 and 2 green for a creature beast sits with kicker 2 in the green. This spell can't be countered. It has hexproof. It's had haste. And if Crag Plate Bailoff was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 4+1/+1 counters instead. So if you pay 10 mana for this, you can literally make it a 10/10 with hexproof and haste. Honestly, just by itself, a 6 mana with hexproof and haste is nothing to sneeze at, especially being a 6/6. This is definitely going to be a nice tech card against control-based matchups, since opponents can't counter this. But I do also think this is going to be really cute in Gruul, that especially if you can do like Transmogrify or Luca shenanigans, because being able to cheat this out with turn 4 Transmogrify, or even potentially a turn 5 Luca, is actually ridiculously absurd. So yeah, keep that in mind. Plus, also, if Ramp is really good, just being able to throw this in just mono green Stompy is actually a really nice food for thought. I do think this is also a card that could help essentially against the Ugin based matchups, because if your opponent doesn't have a board state when they play Ugin and do the board wipe, you can easily play this on turn 7, swing in for 6 at Ugin, and make Ugin go bye bye. So yeah, I do think this card will see play potentially in best of 1 or even in best of 3 in the standard format. It's just a very powerful card. You should never underestimate hexproof haste creatures. And yes, I know some people are going to be like, but this card doesn't have trample like Carnage Tyrant. Yeah, that's one of the cons. But there are ways to give this card trample in the format. We have stuff like the Garrick enchantment that gives all your creatures trample. We even have Garrick itself. We even have like a 2-cost spell. We have a lot of ways to give this creature trample. So I do think this is just a card that's a good catch me up card. Honestly, in mono green Stompy, if you go against the ramp matchups and they play Ugin, that way then you can just play this as your recovery card, because then they have to find a way to deal with this. Unless they have a second Ugin in hand, they really are going to have a hard time to deal with this. Now, I will say that Mono Black is going to have a lot more easier time dealing with this card, since Soul Shatter is a card that got revealed. We already talked about it, but still, I do like this card a lot, and it's going to see a lot of standard play. Next up, another goblin to add to the Goblin Party shenanigans that I'll probably be brewing around, Relic Robber. 2 and a red for a 2/2 with haste, Goblin Rogue. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player creates a 0/1 colorless Goblin Construct artifact creature token with this creature can't block, and at the beginning of your upkeep, this creature deals 1 damage to you. I see a lot of people actually kind of not being optimistic about this card. I'm going to be the one rare guy and actually say that this card is actually a lot better than you take at first glance. And the reason why is actually for the fact that this is a free drop, weirdly enough. Here's my argument. I do feel like this card is actually surprisingly decent, because a lot of people are going to have Shock. They are going to have the new Lightning Strike, which we're going to talk about pretty shortly. They are going to have a way to deal with early game and mid-range creatures, so I do feel like you are going to have a relatively good chance to actually get at least 1 point of combat damage in with this creature. And you can also alter your deck design where you can give it evasion of some sort. And if you can at least get 1 point of damage in combat damage with this guy, or 2 points technically. Then you get the artifact creature for your opponent, and being able to use this as a way to incrementally deal damage to your opponent in a burn based deck design, that's actually really, really nice, especially in like go wide deck designs. Especially those like maybe in the Gruul variety that can actually apply a lure effect to one of their creatures. I do feel like there is actually ways for this card to actually see a lot of play in aggro based matchups. The only con that it is a free drop, and the free drop in mono red decks is very popular with stuff like ANATs, Bone Crusher Giant, etc., etc. However, I do think this card is a lot more better than people take at first glance. At the very least, I think it's a really good sideboard card against control based matchups, especially for the fact that you can get that artifact to your opponent and make them get peened a little bit, and such. So, don't underrate this card. I do think it's a lot better than it looks. Next up, we got Into the Royal. 1 and a blue for an instant that also has a kicker for 1 and a blue. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If this spell was kicked, draw a card. Now, this is one of the cards that this is a reprint, and this is a card that is always a playable card in Standard. We actually seen a Dominaria variation of this card that was mostly just a alteration of this card, more or less, that was in the original Zendkikar block. And it was a relatively productive card in the Standard format. So, not really much to talk about since a lot of people already talked about this card. It's relatively good. It's good early game. It's good late game. It's just a good tempo spell. Don't underrate it. It's a very good card. Next up, a really interesting card, Brushfire Elemental. Green and a red for a 1/1 elemental with haste, and has an ability that can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, but it also has landfall. And the landfall trigger is when a land enters the battlefield under your control, this creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. I actually legit like this card for potentially Gruul aggro, just for the factor that it can be used mid game to early game to be just be able to get little points of damage in, and just the factor that it gets that little buff, it's actually very nice. Plus, this actually synergizes very well the Skyclave Pickaxe personally, so the factor, one of the main cons of the card originally when I was looking at it, was the factor that while this is great early game, it does get relatively worse later in the game when your opponent develops their board space. But if you have cards like specifically counter-based strategies or ways to pump it, aka with Skyclave Pickaxe, just being able to say put a Skyclave Pickaxe on this, and then whenever you play a land, it will then get a +4/+4 boost. That is ridiculously absurd. I do think this card actually does have a chance to see play in a Gruul aggro based deck that does use the Skyclave Pickaxe scenarios. This card is a lot more better than it takes for us. And at worst, it's a card that's going to easily be used for spot removal from your opponent, which then can help you play your mid-range to late game threats such as your Questing Beasts, your Garrick Harbingers, your Elder Golgoroths, your Hellkite Tyrants, or Leyline Tyrants, sorry, brain fart, etc., or even Terror of the Peaks, etc., etc., etc. Still, don't underrate this card. This card is actually pretty decent for what it does. Next up, Lol Mage's Familiar. 1 green and a blue for a 2/4 beast that is a mana dork that can tap for green or blue. And whenever you cast a kick spell, you gain 2 life. With some really cute art. I'm not gonna lie. The art on this is really, really cute. Now, as for the card itself, I think it's actually a really decent free drop mana dork. Now, the problem is, in green and blue, the free drop is very competitive with stuff like Uro, etc., etc. However, I do feel like if you're playing kind of like a kicker-based deck design, or you see that you're playing a lot of kicker spells, I do think this is a card to be very considerate. You could make an argument that this is more a limited card, but I do think it does have some applications. Mostly just the factor that it is a 2/4, so it can block a lot of early game aggro creatures. Plus, the kicker spell mechanic is we do have some really good kicker spells currently, so being able to just incrementally gain little 2 life from it. It is a card that has multiple uses. It's a good mana dork. It also allows you to gain 2 life whenever you kick, of course, and it's just a 2/4, so it can block a majority of early game aggro stuff. So I'm actually a lot more optimistic about this card. If it doesn't see much play, it's mostly just due to the factor that Simic, even post rotation, is still going to have a lot of powerful free drops, aka Uro, etc., etc. So I say keep an eye on it, but yeah, there is also a chance that this might just only see a limited play. But I do think it's decent for what it does. Next up, Synclasm. 1 in a red for a instant spell that has Kicker. Synclasm deals 1 damage to each creature. If it was Kick, it deals 2 damage to each creature instead. This one's pretty simple. If you're playing kicker-based mechanics, this is actually a very nice spell. We also, in the standard meta, have a lot of 1 toughness creatures, like Fervent Champion, etc., etc. So I do feel like this is a great tech card against those decks. And at the worst, it's just a Flame Sweep, and Flame Sweep did see a lot of play in standard to help against like early game aggro decks. So at the very least, I do think this has a chance to at least see sideboard play at the very least. So it's a card to keep an eye on. Next up, Phylath, I believe is how you pronounce it, World Sculptor. 4 red and a green for a legendary creature elemental. It's a 5/5 and has when it enters the battlefield, create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each basic land you control. And it also has landfall for whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Put 4+1/+1 counters on a target plant you control. Honestly, I think this is great for EDH. As for standard, maybe. I will say that Red Green Ramp is probably potentially very good with stuff like Cultivate, Sad Robot, and such. So if you play a ramp deck that allows to get a lot of basics on the battlefield, this can be a significant threat pretty quick. Because the fact is, if you can create a wide enough board stance, you could play just like a simple Trumpet Blast spell and pretty much do lethal to your opponent very quick without even a landfall trigger in general. So, but the problem is, it is also a very late game card potentially in some instances, and I do feel like we do have a lot of good board wipes. I think the main con I have with this card is that it is even costed, and the plant tokens are going to be even costed. So this can easily, as well as the plant tokens, die to a extinction event, for example, or will die to a shatter in the sky. However, Heroic Intervention is still a card, but even Extinction Fit still kind of kills it, even with Heroic Intervention. So, yeah, this is a card where I think it's really good. It has the potential for standard, but it also has the potential just to mostly be a brawl card. I think this is more a better brawl card than anything else, either in the main or as your commander. So keep an eye on it. It might have a chance, but I do also see a chance that this might not see much play in standard, if I'm being honest. Next up, Archon of Amelia. 2 and a white for a creature Archon, 2 free flying. Each player can't cast more than 1 spell each turn, and non-basic lands your opponent control into the battlefield tap. I actually like this card a lot. This actually is a very powerful hate bear card in the format, especially since, while a lot of the popular lands are going to be the triomes, there is stuff like this can negate Fatal Passage, which is really cute. But also, it might actually negate, if it gets popular enough, the modular land cycle, the mythic variation, where you have the choice of it entering in the battlefield untap. Due to the fact of how Amelia worded, they will enter tap no matter what. So this is actually a nice tech card for standard and such, especially if the mythic rare module land spell cycle cards does actually see a lot of play. Also, this is actually going to be a nice historic card since shock lands are still going to be very popular, as well as all other non-basic lands in the format. So you can actually attack against some very greedy mana bases in historic, which is actually really, really good. So plus, it's also just a free mana 2 free flyer, which is actually perfectly fine. So I could even see this seeing a chance as a tech card in the blue white flyers deck, even in the sideboard or main board. And also, just that each player can't cast more than 1 spells each turn. You have to be very cautious with that one, because that also includes yourself. But I do feel like if you're mostly like an on curve play, you're going to play a turn 3 play, turn 4 play, etc., etc., then that part's not going to be that punishing if you brew your deck right, so keep it in mind. Nevertheless, though, I do like Archon Amelia a lot. It is a really good hate bear. Well, hate flying uprated bear, more or less. Speaking of that other good red mythic I was talking about, this one's a doozy. Morag, Fury of Akum. 4 and 2 red for a Sit legendary creature Minotaur Warrior. Each creature you control gets +1 for each time it attacks this turn. You're wondering how it's going to attack multiple times? Well, it's because it has a landfall ability that whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase. At the beginning of that combat, untap all creatures you control. So, clarification, you don't get an additional post-combat main phase with this card, you will just get an additional secondary combat phase. Quick clarification there. I kind of mistake that clarification when I initially looked at the card on Twitter, But a lot of people corrected me out on that, so my bad. Still, even with that correction in mind, this card is silly. This is a really, really powerful card. I feel like this is a card that just screams Gruul, because I think this is a card that's going to synergize very well with land fetch spells, such as Evolve in Wilds. It synergizes with stuff like Fatal Passage, Cultivate, Migration Path. Just being able to use any of your land fetch spells just as additional combat steps is ridiculously absurd, and also has really good synergies, especially since green specifically has a lot of good creatures that don't mind attacking additional time. Elder Galgaroth, for example. There's even like questing beasts if you're trying to get down like a very, very big planeswalker, etc., etc. So, Morag, definitely going to be an EDH staple, but I do think this actually does have some potential in Gruul based standard decks to actually be a very scary card. Plus, you can also transmogrify and get this out early, or Luca to get this out early, which kind of legit scares me if I'm not gonna lie. This card's gonna be silly. Next up, Seagate Restoration, which is also the blue part of the Mythic Muldra land cycle. So, 4 and free blue for sorcery, draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. You have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game. So, and then also you have the choice of playing this as just a untapped land if you're willing to play it for your life. Honestly, I think this card is going to be an EDH staple card. I do think this is a very powerful effect, especially in control-based EDH decks. In standard, there is an argument to put this in your control deck, especially since we do have ways to draw multiple cards, so you can use this to be a decent draw spell. However, I'm not sure. I know a lot of people are just saying, oh, you can just throw this in your land slot, and you could, but I don't know. This is one of those cards where I can see it is a low opportunity cost card. No denying that. But I do feel like this is a card that I feel like just the spell portion of it is a lot more anticlimactic than people take at first glance. Like, for this card to be really good, you need to have at least 3 cards in your hand. 4 would be awesome. But, as is, if you have like only 1 or 2 cards in your hand, this card is really bad. So, I could be wrong. This card might be as good of as just a 2 of in any control shell, and that's what I'm seeing a lot of people speculating on. But honestly, I do think this card is a little bit if I'm being legit honest. I will say though, one thing I do adore about this card is the land portion of it. I just love the Seagate Reborn art. Just the little, I think it's a Felid art there. Just looking at that, just the colors, the textures. Adam Paquette did really good on the art on this card. So, just a little food for thought there, nevertheless. Like I said, it probably will see play, but I could also see a world where it doesn't see play. Next up, another very powerful 2-drop for red, Kargan Intimidator. 1 in a red for a creature human warrior. It's a free 1. It also has Carrots Can't Block Warriors, and it has an activated ability of 1 mana to choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. This creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Target creature becomes a coward until end of turn, or target warrior gains trample until end of turn. This card, if a warrior-based deck can work, will be ridiculously absurd. It's a very powerful 2-drop. Just being able to essentially make just the fact that it has the activated ability of if you were playing a pretty much a 1-class warrior class deck archetype with your deck design that's maybe in the mono red, hopefully. The fact that you can use this to make like one of their biggest creatures not able to block because it becomes a coward, and all your warriors can just go in for damage, that is very, very significant. Plus, its other activated abilities is nothing to sneeze at either. Just the factor that it can get +1/+1, so making it a 4/2 is nice. The fact that it can target itself as well, so it could just be a 4/2 with trample, that's very nice. Or it can make like one of your bigger warriors, like let's say Winota, into like a 5/5 with trample. That's very good. So keep an eye on warrior type cards. I do think this card is going to be a really good 2-drop. And even if it doesn't go into the Warriors deck, I do feel like this is a good 2-card drop for mono red aggro decks, just because all those abilities are very, very powerful in a mono red aggro deck. So, keep an eye on this card. That's all I'm going to say. Next up, I would be very remiss if I didn't talk about this card. Thieving Skydiver, 1 in a blue for a 2-1 with kicker Ets. Note, Ets can't be 0. It's a Merfolk Rogue. It has flying. Oh, and it also has an ETB effect where it enters the battlefield. If it was kicked, gain control of target artifact with converted mana cost Ets or less. If that artifact is an equipment, then you can attach it to Thieving Skydiver. This card is ridiculously absurd. It's a very, very powerful card. Here's the thing. This is mostly a card that's going to see a lot of its play in Eternal formats like Legacy and also like Modern and such. Because there are a lot of Eternal formats that play powerful early game artifacts, and the fact that you can play this on turn 3 to snatch any one of those powerful early game artifacts is nothing to sneeze at. Plus, in EDH, you can just use this to steal Soul Ring or even a Mana Crypt, which is absolutely hilarious. But also, there's some really good standard applications with this card as well. Like, for example, if your opponent's playing Selesnya counters and they're playing Stonecoil Serpent, the fact that this is a free mana, if you kick 2-1 flyer that steals your opponent's Stonecoil Serpent, ridiculously absurd. You can also use this, like, if you're playing, like, an Equipment Matter deck, you can use this as a semi-combat, kind of like trickish in a sense, where you can, like, let's say you have a Shadow Spear, then you can play this on turn 3, equip the Shadow Spear automatically to this, so it's a free 2 with Flying, Trample, and Lifelink. That's really powerful. Plus, also is relevant to the other kind of like equipment-based cards, so yeah, I do think this card does. This card is absurd. It's going to see play in multiple formats. It's a very powerful card that Zendkikar had provided us. Next up, Royal Eruption. 1 in a red for sorcery with kicker 5. It deals 3 damage to any target. If the spell was kicked, it deals 5 damage instead. It's sorcery speed spell. This one's pretty simple. If you're playing Mono Red Burn in Standard, you're probably going to play this card. I don't think it's going to see much play in the Eternal formats, but still, it's a very powerful spell that can ramp up later in the game. And it can target anything, so you can use it to remove Planeswalkers, you can use this to deal damage to your opponent. It's a really good card. It will see a lot of standard play in the Mono Red aggro decks. Next up, Inscription of Ruin. 2 in a black with a kicker of 2 and 2 black. Choose one, and if the spell is kicked, you can choose any of them. Target opponent discards 2 cards. Return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, or destroy a target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less. I like this card more for EDH. I think in Standard, it's a little too costly, especially the fact that you have to use the kicker 7. I will say, modular cards in black is nothing to underestimate. I do think this might be a decent sideboard card in mono black control. Main board, probably not. I mean, all those effects are really anticlimactic, all things considered. Reanimating ability is not something to underestimate, plus also the being able to destroy early game creatures, nothing to underestimate. You could also make an argument that this might be a main board card and you sideboard it out when you see what your matchup is with better tech cards against that. I can definitely see that argument. Overall, it's definitely one of the least exciting descriptions of the cycle, but I do think it's a lot more practical than people are saying, in my personal opinion. Next up, we're going to talk about Shadow Skull Smashing. This is the red portion of the modal spell land cycles. It's a sorcery spell. It's red and red. It deals X damage, divided as you choose among up to 2 target creatures and or planeswalkers. If X is 6 or more, this spell deals twice X damage divided as you choose among them instead. I think this is a very powerful card in the kind of like mono red or Gruul based deck designs, even can be thrown in the land portion. Just the fact that you have that potential to be a really good mid-game removal spell is nothing to underestimate, especially the fact that it can deal damage to planeswalkers. Yeah, the fact that it can't deal damage to face is a little bit oof, but I do feel like this is a card that's a lot more better than taken at first glance. Like the fact that if you can use this just as a 5 mana cone of fire, not bad. And the fact that if you are a late game, you top deck this and you don't play as a land, you can still use it as a very efficient mid game kind of like board wipe-ish style spell to an extent. I do think this card is a lot better than people take at first glance. It'll be interesting to see if you want to play this more as a spell or play it more as a replace it in your land slot and then just play as a land a majority of the time. It will definitely be interesting to see how people will play with this card, but I do think it's potentially really good. Next up, Fierce Fledging. 1 and a white for a 1/1 Griffin. And landfall whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, and it gains flying until in a turn. This might be cute for Selesnya counter decks. I'll be legit honest though, I'm really only talking about this card because I adore the art. The art on this is absolutely hilarious. But in landfall-based mana decks, don't underestimate this card. The fact that it gives itself evasion is actually pretty nice, so maybe in a mono-white aggro deck that has a landfall-based mechanic, that's definitely something to consider, or in Selesnya counters. So keep an eye on this little goofy griffin. Seriously, that art makes me chuckle every time I see it. Next up, Adventure Awaits. 1 and a green for a sorcery spell. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you didn't, put a card into your hand this way. Draw a card. Honestly, I actually like this card over the other type of spells that are like this, just because the fact that it does have a failsafe mechanism, being able to draw a card if you don't draw a creature card from it, which is actually really nice. So the fact that this has a defense-based mechanism within itself does not make it it's at least a 2-mana draw card, which is perfectly fine, but the fact that you can dig into your deck and try to get a creature that you want to play on turn free, very nice. I do like this card a lot. It's one of those cards that is a lot more decent than taken at first glance. And it's up, Royal Regrowth. 2 and a green for an instant spell. So this is a card that's going automatically in my Kalamat's EDH deck. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. Sacrifice a land, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them into your battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. So completely honest, very good card. Just it's a free mana ramp spell that can be on instant. I could see blue-green decks playing this, especially if they want to hold up counter magic. So if they don't have to counter something, then they can just play Roiling Regrowth and then just ramp. That's very powerful. Yes, free drops are competitive with Uro, but I think they're going to make an exception to this card because the card is a pretty decent ramp spell, all things considered. Yeah, just the fact that it's instant speed is what makes it powerful. If it was sorcery speed, I would not be talking much about this card, but the fact that it's instant makes this card very, very good, in my opinion. Next up, Seagate Stormcaller. 1 and a blue for a human wizard 2/1. It has kicker of 4 and a blue, and it has when this creature enters the battlefield, copy the next instant sorcery spell with converted mana cost 2 or less. You cast this turn when you cast it. If Seagate Stormcaller was kicked, copy that spell twice instead. You may choose new targets for the copies. Honestly, I like this card a lot. I do think in the blue-red Izzet like wizard deck, this is the perfect card because being able to just copy, as much as it's anticlimactic to be like, oh, it's just a spell that costs 2 or less, that's very anticlimactic. No, it's not. There is a lot of powerful cards that are in the 1 mana, 2 mana range that are very good. Like, even if we jump into Historic, being able to turn free this, just play this, and then Thoughtseize to do a selective Mind Rot to your opponent to just take 2 of their best cards, sure, you don't mind losing the 4 life doing that. Then there's also stuff like, for example, just being able to use this as a shock to make your shock a lot more effective against mid-range creatures. That's very nice. There's even the fact that, like, for example, Adventurer Waits, if we're talking blue and green. So we play Adventurer Waits, we then copy it twice, so it allows us to draw potentially 2 cards, or just dig 10 cards deep into our library for 2 creature cards. That is very absurd. I would say keep an eye on all the 1 cost, 2 cost spells that are in the formats that you're playing this card in, because they become a lot more powerful due to this card. So don't sleep on it. I won't go and say that it is the Snapcaster Mage of Standard, but it is pretty close. Next up, one of my favorite landfall enchantments from the set, Valakut Exploration, 2 and a red for an enchantment. It has landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. Fascinating. And then, at the beginning of your instep, if there are cards exiled with this card, put them into the owner's graveyard. Then this enchantment will deal that much damage to each opponent. Very powerful card. This is a really good card for EDH shenanigans, especially in mono red. Just being able to get semi card draw anytime you play a land is really, really nice. This is also a really good standard card for the card draw engine as well. This just reminds me of a semi Shanor Torch of Defiance draw effect. Plus, the factor is if you play multiple lands and multiple exile cards, that allows you to draw more cards. And even then, if you exile the cards, you still get, if you can't play them, you still get the burn effect, which then Just allows you to deal damage to your opponent. That's very nice. This is a great card. It synergizes really well with stuff like Fiery Emancipation. I'm kind of tempted to make a Jeskai Dance of the Man's Dance of the Man's Desk, or blah, Dance of the Man's deck, where I kind of play Valkut Exploration as well as Fiery Emancipation and reanimate all those with that, as well as probably like the Green Omen that allows you to fetch for lands and such. Because I feel like you can do some silly shenanigans. So maybe it's more of a 4-color deck, actually, now coming to think of it. I probably would put the Omnath in that deck since you don't have to play black, so something to keep in mind. I'm going to say that. So, overall, I love this card. I think it's a really good card. It's a good card draw engine for red, and the fact that it does incremental burn damage is awesome. Next up, Crawling Barrens. Just a generic mana land that you can spend 4 mana into it, put 2+1/+1 counters on the land, and then you may have it become a elemental creature until in a turn it's still a land. It's a man land. Man lands are always very popular, especially in control-based decks, so keep an eye on this card. Also, cute interaction with the elemental thoughts to decrease the activation cost of this, so being 2 mana to do this effect is very nice. So if a Jeskai control deck works and they want to play the elemental thoughts that does the decrease in the activated abilities, you definitely can be cute with this card. Do keep in mind we do have land hate upcoming in the format. We'll talk about the land hate spell shortly, but still, this is a really nice card. It also can potentially synergize pretty well with maybe Selesnya counters, maybe, potentially. So, don't sleep on this one. This is actually a pretty decent man land, especially in control decks. Next up, Feed the Swarm. 1 in a black for a sorcery spell. Destroy target creature or enchantment an opponent controls. You lose life equal to the permanent's converted mana cost. Very powerful removal spell. Definitely good in EDH. It's definitely going to probably see some standard play, especially if people do try to play with that new Mythic Demon, since this is a way to lose life a lot, so that's something to keep in mind. But also, it's just a very powerful removal spell. Just unconditional removal. You do lose life, but sometimes you might synergize with life loss, so something to keep in mind. It's a powerful card. The only thing that makes it costly is its sorcery speed when we have a lot of better instant removal, spot removal spells in the format. And the fact that this doesn't target planeswalkers is costly, but still, this as a enchantment removal spell in black is nothing to underestimate. Next up, Zagras, Thief of Heartbeats. 4 red and a black for a legendary creature vampire rogue. It's a 4/4, and it costs 1 less for each creature in your party. It has flying, death touch, haste. Other creatures you control have death touch, very nice effect. And also, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. Quick intro to it. I love this card. I love it as a good tech against planeswalkers. I do love the fact that I can synergize with death touch mana shenanigans. I do love it that since it's a good payoff for potentially party-based decks within the Rakdos variety, or those that have Rakdos colors within their deck design. Also, by itself, just a 6 mana 4/4 flying death touch haste, nothing to underrate. It's also rogue, so it might do some rogue synergies if you're playing Grits as rogues. Very powerful card. And also being able to make your creatures have death touch, like, for example, if you can make, like, say, for example, a really big trample creature have death touch, ridiculously absurd, especially if you can play, like, an early game trample creature and such. Very good card. Also, do I have to mention the Embercleave clause? Yeah, the Embercleave clause. Good card. It's a really good card. Next up, Angel of Destiny. 5 mana for an Angel Cleric 2/6. It has flying, it has double strike, and it has whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each gain that much life. That's kind of cool. But also, at the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 or more life than your starting life total, each player Angel of Destiny attacks this turn loses the game. So this is a really cool alternate win condition for white EDH decks. But I do also kind of love this card potentially for standard, because in an Orzhov life gain deck, this is actually surprisingly a really good finisher. It could be used as an alternate win condition. Plus, also, if you want to counteract the life gain that your opponent's going to get, here's a tip. Veto is a card. Veto will negate the life gain that they get from it, since when you gain life, as long as your creatures have lifelink, which you're going to gain life no matter what because of the clause of the way how Angel of Destiny's clause, then you use your life gain you get from the Angel of Destiny trigger to just deal the damage with Veto to your opponent, so your opponent doesn't get the life gain, which is a really, really nice combo. I could definitely see some Orzhov life gain decks that are comboing Veto with Angel of Destiny. So keep an eye on that combo. That's the combo that's going to probably make this card see some standard play. And last, but certainly not least, Cleansing Wildfire. 1 in a red for a sorcery spell. Destroy target land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle their library, and you draw a card. I like this card a lot. I like it that it's a good land hate spell that can actually help us against kind of like potentially problematic mana bases that it might form with the upcoming standard. Like if someone does get greedy and do the I'm gonna throw all the moto, I'm gonna replace my lands with all moto cards. That's gonna be cool, ha ha ha. This card completely negates that because what you can do is essentially destroy target land, and they can't search for a basic because they decide not to put a basic in their deck. So yeah, word of advice: when you're constructing, always put basics in your deck, even if it's just like 3 or 4. Always put basics in your deck. But the factor is that it also replaces itself very nice, and it's also a common, so this is actually going to be decent Popper to help against Poppertron. That's very nice. But I do think it has some play in standard, especially since we have the Tri-Elms, we also have the Castle Cycle, and we're going to have the Modal Land Cycles as well. So keep an eye. This might see a lot more play than you think at first glance. And overall, that is my review of all the cards that have been revealed so far. Sorry I had to skip a lot of them. Consider the fact that the majority of them I think are just limited cards. If you, like I said before, if you want me to talk about a card that I skipped, just let me know in the comments or through Twitter. Nevertheless, though, this set is looking up to be pretty sweet. I can't wait to talk about more of the set following Monday and such with the reveals and such and throughout the week. I hope you all have a lovely day. This is Levdep, signing out.